Nature is all about inherited diversity. Ever since Mendel laid out the principles of genetics with his experiments with sweet peas, science has been enthralled with the multifaceted world of genetics. It is interesting that a gardener discovered genetics because we have to deal with it every season when we select seed to save and observe how characteristics change from one year to another. In this episode, I'll share how I happened upon a new cherry tomato variety on my garden and how you too can try to come up with your own tomato variety. I'll also share a delicious recipe with my harvest you will not want to miss. I've been growing tomatoes ever since I started gardening. Actually, even before that. I remember growing a tomato plant as a child on a windowsill in São Paulo, Brazil. Bereft of proper fertility, it yielded a small fruit that I proudly shared with my whole family. I had used seed from a store-bought fruit and had no clue as to its genetic makeup. It probably was a commercial hybrid. The tomatoes I grow today are usually open pollinated heirlooms. They have been bred to bear true to seed. That is, a parent tomato will bear a child tomato with very similar characteristics. F1 hybrids are the first generation of a cross and are usually unstable. Tomatoes usually self-pollinate, but they are capable of interbreeding, but it is rarer and depends on the behavior of natural pollinators. I had planted, as I usually do, several varieties of tomatoes, including the wild Galapagos tomato. This is actually a different species of tomato that is known to interbreed more readily with other varieties from the typical tomato species. I saved seed from the last season and planted it again. But I noticed that some of the fruit had developed different characteristics. While the original Galapagos tomato I had planted was more orange and smaller, this plant featured bigger tomatoes with a distinctively redder color. It showed the same prolific growth habit, and when I decided to taste the fruit, I noticed the flavor was much more intense and layered. While the original Galapagos tomato featured a more tart and very tomato smell and flavor, this cross was sweeter with complex flavors similar to black creme or brandy wine, two varieties I had grown together with it the previous season. It also showed the annoying trait of splitting its skin easily, leading to several fruit rotting on the vine before being harvested. This was clearly a characteristic of the Galapagos tomato. I could only hope it would impart disease resistance to its offspring. The mixed characteristics of growth, size, and flavor led me to conclude that indeed the Galapagos tomato had hybridized with one of the heirloom tomatoes and had created a potentially new variety, all naturally. I was thrilled to discover that and made sure to save the seeds to continue growing this variety. I could try to stabilize the variety to get constant characteristics from generation to generation, perhaps improving it and maybe even getting to name it. I don't know if this variety will keep its awesome flavor over the coming years. I don't know if this was only a fluke, a lucky draw from the mysterious genetic pool of tomatoes. Would I be able to preserve this variety? Only the future would know. Coming up in the next block, I will share with you what I did with the tomato harvest, creating a delicious homemade spaghetti with a slightly unorthodox recipe. You won't want to miss it right after this commercial. I would like to especially thank all of those viewers who have purchased art from my Etsy shop. This week I'm featuring additional plant tags with other vegetables due to popular demand. If you have noticed a more regular upload of episodes recently, it is precisely because of those who have supported the channel, either through Etsy purchases or Patreon, or by even watching all the commercials in these videos. Thank you. Your support makes these videos possible. I started making my homemade spaghetti with an unorthodox choice, Atta flour. This is an India wheat flour that is used to make chapatis and other traditional Indian baked goods. I put about 2 cups into a mixer, adding a pinch of salt and a couple of tablespoons of olive oil as I mix the flour with the dough hook. I made tomato sauce from my harvest and wanted to make my own homemade pasta to complement it and have a truly homemade meal. I just cannot call it a fully homegrown meal because I did not grow the wheat myself. That would have been a bit tougher to do. This Atta flour makes a very elastic dough. Although it will not bake into tall loaves of bread like Western flour, it can be stretched thin. I slowly added water into the mixture until the dough had come together in a uniform, smooth ball. While I'm using a stand mixer here, it is possible to do this by mixing with your hand and kneading the dough well. Using the mixer is just more convenient, it saves work and is less messy. Be careful when adding water so you don't add too much. You don't want runny dough. If that happens, you can add a bit of flour. Also, the more you knead the dough, the more elastic it will become. Having elastic dough is essential when rolling out pasta, otherwise it will tear as you roll it thinner. To roll out the dough, I use a pasta machine attaching it to the counter with a hook. These stainless steel hand crank machines work really well and are built to last. With the machine secure in place, I divided the dough into 4 parts to make rolling easier. This flour makes a very soft dough that is a pleasure to work with. I dusted the pieces of dough with flour to help them not stick to the pasta machine and started to crank out the sheets of pasta. This is a very fun step that kids love to help with, being such a hands-on process. In fact, it feels more like a craft project than cooking. To get the pasta to be strong, I folded it into itself several times, rolling it out each time, adding a dusting of flour whenever needed. I started with the roller set at the widest distance, making them closer and closer as I went along. The dough started to show a supple resistance that signified that the gluten was being well developed. This would hold the pasta together when cooking. The more times you roll the pasta into itself, the better it is. When the pasta felt like it was well developed, I rolled it out the last time on a thinner setting. I did not set it to the thinnest setting because that would have been too thin. If you don't have a pasta machine, you can do this with a rolling pin. It may not be as fun, but it will work just as well. I used the spaghetti attachment to cut the pasta into strips. You can cut it with a knife if you don't have this. You can also use the larger pasta sheets as lasagna if you want to. This attachment makes thin spaghetti strips. I dusted the cut spaghetti with flour immediately after cutting them to prevent them from sticking. This is an important step. Otherwise, all your noodles will stick together, creating a dense mat. Another way of dealing with this is to dry the noodles by hanging them in skewers as you process them. I put salted water to boil and went about creating the sauce and vegetable garnish to finish the dish. I got a summer squash from my experimental polyculture bed and cut it into strips. As I had shown in a previous video, this bed was providing me with a variety of vegetables here and there, so instead of getting a glut of one type of vegetable all at once, I had enough diverse provisions to come up with different recipes as the veggies were harvested. I wanted to simply sear the squash to bring out its natural flavor. I added olive oil and turmeric powder to a cast iron skillet and sprinkled some cumin seeds, toasting them slightly. I then dropped in the squash sticks, mixing them with a spatula until they were turning golden brown without overcooking. I seasoned with salt and turned the heat off. The water was in a running boil, so I dropped the pasta, letting it cook as I gently stirred. Do not stir it too much. Fresh pasta will easily come apart. It will cook quickly. I had previously prepared some of my own tomato sauce from the diverse harvest of tomatoes as I have shown in a previous video. I removed the cooked pasta after a couple of minutes when the water had returned to a boil. Fresh pasta cooks very quickly, so make sure not to overcook it, otherwise it will completely break apart. Because of its delicate nature, instead of draining the pasta in a strainer, I carefully fished it out of the water. I ladled the fresh homemade pasta with fresh homemade homegrown tomato sauce, topping with the seared homegrown summer squash, and made sure to enjoy this. Fresh food is something else. You will only know that once you try it. Hey everyone, I was recently featured in a podcast interview with Daniel and Rachel Alcione about the Suburban Homestead channel and home gardening. If you want to check it out, the link is down in the description.